For many political theorists, violence is the ultimate manifestation of power. If power is simply the ability to make others obedient, then violence surely is the ultimate form of creating obedience. As Hannah Arendt says in On Violence, violence can cause the obedience that every criminal can count on when he snatches my pocketbook with the help of a knife. Is power simply the ability to make others obedient, though? And is violence simply an expression of power? This is something that Hannah Arendt argues against, arguing in On Violence that violence is the opposite of power. However, Arendt argues from a unique standpoint, giving us a model of power that differs from many other models of power put forward by people like Dahl, Weber, Bachrach and Baratz, and others. Here, I aim to explore Hannah Arendt's claim that power is the opposite of violence by measuring it against not only her own model of power, but the models of power put forward by other philosophers like I just mentioned. The reason for assessing it against other models, rather than solely against Arendt's own model, will hopefully become clear as the video progresses. While it might be expected that we would look at Hannah Arendt's model of power first, we'll instead begin with Robert Dahl's definition of power. According to Dahl, A has power over B to the extent that he can get B to do something that B would not otherwise do. Here we have a definition of power modeled on confrontation and force. For Dahl, power is Agent A having the ability to force Agent B to behave in the way that Agent A desires Agent B to behave. Implicit in this definition is power being the ability of Agent A to force Agent B to be obedient to Agent A, even if there is resistance. Does this implication give us cause to think that violence and power are the same in this instance? A simple intuition might cause us to answer an agreement that violence and power are the same here, because the use of violence, sometimes even the threat of violence, is often a great way of creating obedience, and therefore power. At least power in the sense of Dahl's definition. Violence is often an effective way for Agent A to get Agent B to do something they might not otherwise do. There is an important distinction to be made here, though, and that is the distinction between the instrumental use of violence to create the obedience and the power itself. A part of Arendt's argument that power is the opposite of violence is that violence is only necessary when power has been lost. It would seem that even in the case of Dahl's definition, it would appear that violence would only become necessary when the power has been lost. The violence is used instrumentally to regain the power. It is how Agent A asserts their authority over Agent B in order to get Agent B to do something that Agent B would not otherwise do. Does this necessarily mean that violence is the opposite of power in this case, though? There's nothing in Dahl's definition that would suggest this. Power is confrontational according to Dahl's definition, and violence is simply an instrument used by Agent A in order to achieve that power over Agent B. Questions could be raised here over whether the power wielded by Agent A is a legitimate power, and this idea of legitimacy is important in Arendt's own model of power with regards to the question of whether violence is the opposite of power. However, Dahl's definition makes no distinction between legitimate and illegitimate power, and therefore it would appear that violence, while distinct from power, is not the opposite of power. Another important definition of power is Max Weber's definition. Weber defines it as such. Power, or Macht, is the probability that one actor within a social relationship will be in a position to carry out his own will despite resistance. There's nothing in Weber's definition that would indicate that violence and power are opposites. With Weber defining power as the probability that an actor in a social relationship will be able to carry out their will despite resistance, then it appears to be quite the opposite of Arendt's claim. As with Dahl's definition, a distinction needs to be made between power and violence being instrumental. However, in the case of Weber's definition, violence being used instrumentally simply becomes part of the probability that the actor will be able to carry out their will, rather than the opposite of power. The definitions provided by Dahl and Weber appear to give us cause to criticize Arendt's claim that power is the opposite of violence. Violence may be distinct from power, but in the definitions provided by Dahl and Weber, there appears to be room for violence to be considered as an instrumental part of achieving power, or using power. However, we would be remiss to end our discussion here, for while power might not be the opposite of violence in the case of the definitions provided by Dahl and Weber, we also have to consider that the definitions that Dahl and Weber provide us with show us only one dimension of power. We must consider that there are other dimensions of power, ones that are not as visible as the power displayed in the cases of Dahl and Weber. Bachrach and Baratz, 1962, provides us with another dimension of power, a dimension that is not as visible or as easy to measure as the one provided by something like Dahl's definition. Bachrach and Baratz remind us that there are those that have the power to control the conversation and to shape the discourse. For example, a meeting can be controlled in such a way that it does not allow for dissenting opinions to be brought up, or conversations that could lead to a change in the status quo can be stopped before they even begin. Well, this power could appear at a social level, of course. It is a power that would be more prevalent at an institutional level. An employer could create an atmosphere that is hostile to employees joining unions, and therefore a form of collective power is removed from the employees. Power like this could even be hidden behind a facade of encouragement for union membership, due to the way the power is structured, and the way said power controls the working environment. Unlike the previous definitions of power, this type of power could be said to support Hannah Arendt's claim that power is the opposite of violence. Violence is something that is visible and born of conflict. Well, this kind of power could be said to be a power that seeks to avoid conflict. If violence becomes involved, then it is no longer this kind of conflict. A further refinement of the definition of power comes from Stephen Luke's 2005, who states that A exercises power over B when A affects B in a manner contrary to B's interests. Luke's definition is inclusive of cases covered by Dahl and Weber, while avoiding trappings of power being necessarily confrontational. Though it does not cover the kind of power meant by Foucault when he discusses the creation of subjects. It does mean that it is inclusive of cases like those defined by Bachrach and Baratz's definition of power, as Bachrach and Baratz's definition involves cases where power is shaping the conversation in a manner that is contrary to the interests of those without power. The use of power over brings us to Amy Allen's definition of power over. Amy Allen defines power over as the ability of an actor or set of actors to constrain the choices available to another actor or set of actors in a non-trivial way. While Luke's definition explicitly uses the term power over, the previous definitions are all examples of Allen's 1998 definition also. Other distinctions about types of power that Allen 1998 makes are power to and power with. At the beginning of the video, I stated that assessing Arendt's claim about power and violence being opposites against definitions of power that are beyond Arendt's own model was important. And this is one of the reasons why it is important. It is important to understand not only that there are different definitions of power, but also that there are different kinds of power. There is nuance that must be understood and nuance that must be allowed for when asserting that claim. That nuance is that Hannah Arendt does not give us a model of power over. Instead, she gives us a model of power with. This distinction is important because it means that assessing Arendt's claim solely against models of power based on power over would not be assessing it fairly. Having said that, though, it would also be assessing it unfairly if we were to compare it only against her own model, or simply against types of power belonging to the category power with. For violence is not antithetical to certain types of power over. So what is power with? Amy Allen defines power with in the following way. When power is understood in terms of power with, it can be summed up as the ability of a collectivity to act together for the attainment of a common or shared ends or series of ends. Arendt defines power as the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. As we can see by contrasting Arendt's definition of power with Allen's definition of power with, Arendt's version of power counts as a form of power with. Power is not something that can belong to an individual, it belongs to groups and exists only so long as that group exists. For Arendt, power belongs to political communities, and it is that political community that gives the power its legitimacy. While we can speak of an individual as though they are in power, and as though they have power, this power we speak actually comes from the group that they represent. Violence, on the other hand, is something that is instrumental and is recognized phenomenologically. The instrumental nature of violence was discussed previously in the video, acknowledging that it is not necessarily in opposition to the previous definitions. According to a definition like Weber's, power is the probability that actor A can assert their will over actor B, and violence can add to the probability that agent A can assert their will over agent B, as violence can make a resistor submissive. However, this clearly does not apply to a definition of power like Arendt's. If power is distinguished by the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert towards some end, and violence is distinguished by its phenomenology and its instrumental nature, the two cannot be considered the same. Arendt also argues that violence cannot lead to power. Well, violence could obviously be used to force a group of individuals to behave in a particular way toward a particular end, and they would appear to be behaving collectively and appear to have a common goal or common end. It would not be voluntary. For Arendt, part of the legitimacy of the power of a political community comes from the fact that we are acting as free agents. They are coming together in a voluntary manner and working collectively as individuals toward that goal voluntarily. If violence was used to force them to work together in this way, then this would not meet Arendt's standard for what power is. The obedience that comes from the end of a gun is not power, according to Arendt's model. It is simply obedience brought on through the use of force. Violence can begin to exist when power is being lost, and to cling on to power that is not supported through a greater voluntary political community, of course. When the tyrant feels his power disappearing, violence can extend it. However, as stated by Arendt, even a government of tyranny relies not solely on violence. One man cannot supply enough violence to control the nation. Even the tyrant needs a strong base of power. In the case of a tyrant, there must be people voluntarily working towards the same goal of keeping the tyrant in power in order for the tyrant's power to remain. It is the power base that enables the tyrant to use violence as an instrument of rule. If that power base was to suddenly lay down arms, no amount of violence performed by the tyrant would allow him to continue to rule. There can be no government based solely on violence. Power is always necessary to be able to enforce the violence. So, if in the context of power with, violence exists as an instrument of failing power, and power can never come from violence, only from a voluntary collective working towards some end or goal, then it seems that it is safe to say that power is the opposite of violence. Violence is the destroyer of power, not the creator, meaning that in the context of power with, Arendt would be correct to claim that power is the opposite of violence. However, if Arendt's claim is made in a broad sense, then we have reason to be critical of it. The claim does not take other kinds of power into account. One could argue that the kinds of power argued by Dahl, Weber, et al. Are not actual forms of power, because the mugger stealing a pocketbook at the other end of a blade has no legitimacy. However, the fact that we separate out different kinds of power, like power with, power to, and power over, as well as separate political power from something like social power, shows that we view the definitions of Dahl, Weber, et al. As legitimate definitions of power. While we might argue that something like political power needs to be legitimized in a normal fashion, descriptively speaking, the mugger is still exerting a form of power, whether it can be legitimized or not. While we might use the term power interchangeably to describe various categories of power, power is not one type of power or another. It is an umbrella term that covers various categories and kinds of power. It is nuanced, and this nuance must be understood in order to understand that power is not always the opposite of violence, but can be the opposite of violence.